One book I think is really interesting to discuss is A Brother's Price by Wen Spencer. So this is a fairly interesting book, and trigger warning for discussions of grooming and paedophilia. So the premise, the key world building setting is divided into two things. One, for every 10 girl children born, only one boy child born. Or rather, only one boy child survives out of the womb and would survive adulthood, essentially. And the world is essentially stuck in a sort of merge between Victorian titles, Victorian technology, and social classes with meets essentially Wild West, Western visuals, and is somehow a country with a monarchy, which is kind of odd because I would argue culturally one thing that I read a lot of when you think American, you don't think monarchy. Like, yeah, in doing so. One thing I will note though is I don't particularly know what, whilst this reads as American and there is obviously discussion of maple syrup, it also takes place in a place called Queensland, and the plot is essentially sort of very Regency-esque. No idea how to pronounce that, with a focus on the marriage mart that you'd see in something inspired, like take Bridgerton aesthetic essentially and gender swap it. Although I will note that this book was published in 2006 and it shows in doing. So obviously I would probably say the other aspect of the world building is everyone is white. So whilst I think the world building is highly interesting, I don't really know I don't really know if the setting is supposed to be white American settlers / colonizers, or England that somehow has American society, or is it another colony? But it is read to be seen as a alternate Earth. Sorry, I know I'm rambling, but you know, I'm not the best person to talk about this. Look, I try and be aware, but obviously my view isn't necessarily the best one. But it's one of those things which I would probably argue it's very hard not to say it isn't troublesome or problematic, I guess. But I would probably say this reads as a very English thing somehow. Well, you know, English-speaking European thing. Look, if everyone knows what I'm talking about, then it probably makes sense. And I'm probably going to get crucified online for this again. Actually, no, that's not what thing they're in crucified. Anyway, I'm rambling. So obviously what I think about the world building, one thing I think it does well is there is no explanation for this. It is not explained why this happened. And one thing I will say about why I would probably praise it is because this is not a novel that is arguing for any particular social cause, but rather it's just an extended speculative what if. The characters, whilst they do say, yeah, it sucks, they have no idea why, because the technology is, I would say, very low. Whilst they have invented technology such as the microscope, they have not invented artificial insemination. which I would, and obviously the attitude towards this are very realistic, more specifically this need of and pride and why they might look at virginity. What I think is interesting is because the man is sleeping with a group of 6 sisters that can be anywhere from 8, 6 to 20. Look, okay, I do wonder if the maths is a bit off because I'm bad. Like, one thing it does highlight is very obviously the need. Essentially, it presents a very straightforward reason why you would want a man who was a virgin and why you'd want your sisters to be vaginal, so they don't catch an STD. And that is illustrated because in one chapter there is discussion of an inheritance scare. And the reason there is an inheritance case is because one of the sisters got an STD which infected everyone else, which left them barren. So, they couldn't have children. So essentially, back to the main story. So it looks at a boy called Jaren. Jaren is 15, nearly 16 years old, and that is the age of majority in that world. And his sisters, so they are a typical homestead family with a farm who all learn self-defense. Jaren, he was taught to read and write to be able to use a pistol, which was generally society not the norm. Because the general state is, as long as he's good with children, so can swaddle a baby, change a diaper, it doesn't really matter, can organize, it's okay. Clean the sheets, so all the stereotypically feminine things that we think of in Western society. And obviously that's considered. In doing so, one day one of his sisters finds an injured woman by the bank. And obviously I think one of his sisters is 14. Not all of them get named. There's that. And obviously they basically go and decide to bring her inside after a brief argument, at risk to Jaren himself, because there's this thing called husband raiding, which is essentially they will steal your man. Literally, because men are not really taught self-defense. And what is interesting is how this is reasoned, because basically one of the reasons men are so highly prized is because women want to be able to have children. And basically there's this idea of, if he says no to one woman, it means he'll say no to every woman, so they just can't have that, which is, I would say, an interesting commentary on rape culture. These men aren't taught to have autonomy because otherwise they basically think, oh no, we can't continue the family line, which is really important. And what is also interesting is how a woman not wanting a child is seen as normal, because it's always assumed that the sisters can. Which also I think was fairly interesting. And obviously it's also very much seen that having a husband, you can either quite literally buy one, or essentially you swap with the neighbour, which also I thought was interesting because it's not really a good deal. What it also goes into is how the strict class system isn't particularly good for lower class women as well, as they're often raised not knowing their biological parent, or their biological parent was they were literally conceived through what we would know as rape. As there's one side character, Captain Turn or Captain Raven, the captain basically says to the Princess Wren, who is the other protagonist, and she's basically like, oh, most women don't know your father, that's a luxury. And for most of us, it's essentially they go to this place called a crib / technically a whorehouse. A man is drugged, and they in a dark room, and they essentially, take advantage of that for a few minutes, and then they leave. And that, whilst is portrayed as disturbing, it's just sort of not really dwelt on. As one thing I think is also interesting is, I would say about this is abuse is never shown to be right. And the characters, whilst they're portrayed as unhappy about this state of affairs, they genuinely cannot see how it could get better. And one of the reasons is because they lack the technology that has allowed modern lives in the 21st century to be better. Or at least ideally, if we weren't relying on overconsumption quickly and, middle class. So yeah, that's also interesting quirk is how the eldest sister is also known as eldest. So with eldest Whistler, she basically, their mothers is very much, what's also interesting about the marriage is that the mothers of Jaren and his sisters, they basically say, we're not interfering with who you get into because your sisters basically need to choose a guy that they're going to share as a husband. Which also is an interesting fact about the novel's genre, because I would hesitate to call this a romance because whilst it does chronicle Jaren's relationships with a group of sisters, more with the royal family, so they find one sister, her other sisters come, and they decide to rescue her. He gets seduced by one of the eldest known sister, Ren. So she's not named eldest because in the backstory, there was a bomb at a theatre, so they all died. Her elder sisters died, as did their husband. Their husband was essentially, he was this rich, pretty boy who was really seductive, really flirty, but he was considered useless. And also really, really dumb. Which is interesting. So which also ties in with the world building, how it's often, there is extreme collective look. Like if one sister does something wrong, the whole family is killed, even children. Which is also disturbing. And that's also something interesting about the book, is that it has a lot of disturbing world building that is never really explored. And the author has never set another story within this setting. So there's that, really. So obviously, going into the grooming, one thing that's highlighted in the novel is that Jaren, he can't really, his consent is not really something he can give. Like, there's only about 2 women that I would probably say he has emotional relationships. One is Haley, who I think one is Lydia, who is the youngest, one of the younger of the adult siblings, and she's 16, so they're both the same age. And the other is Trini, who I think is roughly nearly 20. This is at least within the confines of the novel, because he's seen as an adult and he's seen as capable and thus treated as such. And that's because their relationship is shown. She doesn't really want to marry again because she was abused by their previous husband, who was dead. Like, badly, And so, but in the novel, she agrees to marry him because the villains, they want to marry Jaren because it was found that the Whistlers are descended from a prince who they quite literally stole from his birth. However, his wives basically run themselves ragged trying to make him happy. So one thing that I probably argue is it borrows from a lot of romance novels or Western novels, or at least novels published with the gender norms of 1970s, where women didn't really have the legal rights, and it sort of flipped. But at the same time, you did have characters proactively doing things. So yeah, that's interesting. One thing that's also note is Jaren is 15, later 16 in the novel. Although I will note, when I first read it, I was like 12. Then I later read it in my teens, and I didn't really read it until about a couple of months ago. So obviously the age thing didn't actually hit me until I was like, oh yeah, this is grooming. Oh yeah, this is weird. And it's very much a case of, obviously men can groom a woman, and as we all hear the stories of how teachers can groom their students, even such as the case of the president of France is one notable example. And even though they can stay together for years. Which is interesting because that kind of, you would assume, is the norm in this book. Like, the men are going to be the younger, the more vulnerable party, just due to the way it's interesting. And when you think about the implications, it isn't particularly great. As another implication is, men, if they marry whilst they still have young women who are like under 18, under 10, they're especially ventured to help raise their children than those younger sisters, because the families just don't split. And because that's generally a norm, although the Whistlers are suggested to do so and have done. And it's very much seen, their mothers are about 10, and they have 28 children, 4 of whom are boys. And that is considered completely abnormal. So yeah, this is a very, very dystopian world. What is also interesting is it's never really explained why this happened, and historically that is just how the society works. What is interesting is we do get a sense of history, because various things are mentioned, especially with the Whistler family, who were essentially were a group of women who weren't actually related but pretended to be. However, because their children were all sired by the same father, then their mothers, it was essentially a case of, because they all looked related enough, they were believed, and they apparently switched sides in this civil war. Which was also interesting was the lack of religion, even though it got mentioned, there was very much a case where ancestral veneration of some kind was seen. Because in the backstory, one character goes to the graves, and it's very much seen as though they're forbidden from adopting children, or like forbidden from fostering, if they're not related. And there's this mention of Hera, Queen of the Olympus. Now that's interesting, even though the society, it very much sort of civic religion in America, like American folk sort of English. The author herself, she is American, according to my research. So there's that. What's also I would say, is interesting is the sheer range of female personalities and how this idea of falling in love with a group of sisters is a good thing, which is not how we think of modern polygamy. So I'm most familiar via pop culture is with polygamous Mormons due to various YouTube clips you see. And in that case, according to my limited research, it's the man is in control and the wives generally aren't related, although it can apparently happen. And they're all desperate, but in this one, it's sort of seen as sort of collective home ownership, which apparently isn't the norm. One thing I will note though is this has nothing, the world building, I would say, has nothing that resembles modern polyamory, because that's very much about choice and people's free will, and often the idea of one woman with a group of men. Sorry, let me rephrase that. A group of one woman with a group. Sorry, let me rephrase that. A group of multiple women with one man is seen as very much something steeped in sexism and essentially only possible either in societies where they were rich men or in cults, at least within the Western imagination, and often sometimes awkwardly. Admittedly, the whole idea of that, although I do know harem, more specifically, the whole fantasy is often steeped in, at least historically, racism. So yeah, it's that. Although personally, I do think the idea of a rich man having his whole collection, lack of a better word, of women isn't really a good thing. Sorry, I'm rambling. Back to A Brother's Price. So what is interesting is about this, he's very much seen as a communal dick among sisters. And it's just very much a case where they're prioritized for their ability to essentially have sex. That is the key thing that they like, because it's mentioned there are groups of sisters who don't know their biological fathers, but they're just sired by the same man in the cribs. And what's also is not really detailed is obviously marginalized genders and marginalized sexualities. So while female bisexuality is discussed, as one of the heroines is bisexual. She had a lover who was stolen or seduced away, rather by the villain, in a way that's very dismissive. So I don't really think, in a way which obviously rich women taking advantage of women who were lower class apparently is probably a thing. It's just said very dismissively, and lesbians are never mentioned. Neither are trans women or trans men. It's just not discussed, and it's very off screen, because obviously it probably does happen. So I honestly don't know how you would approach it, and I do know criticisms of this type of setting are often seen as transphobic due to that, as there was a book I heard about, so knows very much what if all the men disappeared. Admittedly, we probably all die out in a couple of generations. No, it just very much talks about stereotypical cis men and women. Even if in their own world the gender roles are very different, all the main protagonists do confirm to them. And whilst they do talk about, oh, wouldn't it be nice if there were more men? They very much see childbirth as being the woman's choice, and it's just sort of highlighted in a cheeky what if way within the text, which was interesting commentary. So with this book, it's actually a very interesting read, I would say, as the plot, it very much follows, it's sort of, obviously with genre, I would say that it's speculative romance in a weird way, because it does have a couple, or rather a group, and the main plot is facilitated. It's even though it does have a dash of political intrigue, a dash of drama between sisters, the main plot focuses on Jaren. It focuses on his marriage, and it basically ends with a happy finale where it's his wedding day. So there's that, I guess. So talking about the plot, I suppose I should summarize it. So there's a farm boy called Jaren who lives with his sisters on a farm, who are middle class, and one day they rescue a woman called Haley. Haley turns out to be the princesses, and one of the princesses, the eldest, is Ren, who is 26 or 25, and she ends up meeting Jaren, who is going out to check on his siblings, and they basically, it's never actually shown what they did, but the implication is Jaren essentially had oral sex, because he's seen as soiling himself, but nothing penetrative is happened. There are no sex scenes within the novel, which is probably why I would argue most people don't really pick up on the grooming aspect at first, because there's only implication. So he basically, that happens. Haley and Ren, they reunite and they talk about Jaren, and they're like, oh my gosh, he's so handsome. Love at first sight happens and is never questioned. So basically they're like, oh, Ren discovers that Jaren is descended from a missing prince who would have been her great uncle. The third cousin's removed, and so it's like, oh yeah, we can totally marry. So they decide to sponsor his coming out in the capital. So they go to the capital, they head on a boat with eldest Whistler, and before eldest does, they essentially hear news that a raiding party, and they find the corpse of a dead man, which makes them really worried. They get on the boat, they're escorted by one of the Captain Raven, I think her name is. So there's an incident on the boat where one of the sisters they meet a traveler, and they decide, hey, can your brother sleep with my youngest sister? She's totally clean, it'll be fine. They decline, and that's basically seen as a standout of honor. And the eldest Whistlers, they buy a shop they take a loan out on a shop. The loan doesn't really happen. It does happen, rather, so they get on. Ren, on her way back, she meets one of her sisters-in-law, who has a kid called Eldie, who is the only known child of that particular family, of the Brindles, who essentially, they're sort of power hungry, and spoiler alert, are the main villain. So that goes particularly well. Then there's a court case, inheritance case, they take it back. Jaren arrives in the capital. He runs into this mysterious woman called Syrah, who, spoiler alert, turns out to be the missing princess. There's essentially the marriage mart. Jaren gets dressed, he gets turned, made pretty, and he dances with a human woman. The Brindles try and make him a catch, but he gets rejected. He meets another boy, Cullen, who is the prince's cousin, and he's seen as an unsuitable match because that got the skunk. They all like him. So then they get introductions are made. He gets tested. The Wren, they essentially, because her mother's basically said, if you want another husband, all of you have to approve. It gets approved. He moves into the husband quarters. They start renovating it. They find out that there's some kind of plot. Everything goes well. They're happy. Then he gets kidnapped by the Brindles. He meets this woman called Sarah. They bond. So the princesses race to get him back, including a fight on the ship. The ship gets blown up. They rescue Jaren. Then they get married. So there's obviously more things. So that's basically the plot. So I would say it's very simple. The prose is basic, but each character is very well described, and the subtleties of world building and the dialogue, I would say, are generally interesting to read. So yeah, this isn't really a recommendation, it's just me rambling on. I wouldn't really say this is one of my favourite books or interesting, but I do think it's one of those thought-provoking books that I read, and if you can stomach a lot, it wouldn't harm you, although I will note that my book is actually a second-hand copy.